State of the Industry podcast. And here we go. This episode is brought to you by KP Movement Education, your source for health and movement education and coaching. Whether you are a health or fitness professional, a fitness consumer, or perhaps a passive bystander, KP believes that everyone deserves the right to pain-free movement. That's why their memberships and services are designed to educate, empower, and inspire you to create a culture of movement for yourself and those around you. With 2 membership options, you'll find education surrounding developing at-home training programs for yourself or for others, mental health and exercise, lifestyle medicine, and much, much more. Check it out at kineticperformance.ca/memberships. That's kineticperformance.ca/memberships. Welcome back to the State of the Industry podcast. I am your host, Adam Youngsma. This week's episode is part 2 of my lengthy conversation with Dr. Gregory duManoir, a tenure-track instructor with the School of Health and Exercise Sciences at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan. Dr. duManoir is a specialist in cardiovascular physiology, and he really helps to unpack the science behind different types of energy system development and discusses why it is hugely beneficial to have different types of cardiorespiratory training in your arsenal to improve metabolic flexibility of both yourself and your clients. If you haven't already, I suggest that you head over and take a listen to part 1 prior to indulging in part 2. But if you already have, or if scrambled is more your style, then let's dive right in. All right, welcome back, Greg, to part number 2 here. I'm excited to dive back in because, as I said, I've got so many notes here, so many questions that we probably won't be able to get to just based off of time. But there's a lot of really good stuff because I think myself, more earlier in my career than now, because I've grown a little bit. But as a personal trainer, before I was a strength coach, really overlooking the cardiovascular system when you're training clients, simply because, well, resistance training is typically more dangerous, and it's the part that the client generally doesn't know near as well as they're able to go and hop on a piece of cardio equipment or go out for a walk or a run. And so I was guilty, as most trainers are, of overlooking that and not putting enough time and attention into that. Besides, the let's hop you on a treadmill for 3 hours so you can lose some weight kind of thing, the typical use of cardio, and just really overlooking the importance of that cardiorespiratory system, the cardiovascular system, and the delivery of oxygen for, as you said, recovery, right? Is a big piece. So
yeah. I mean, I would agree that the resistance training movements probably require more coaching. And there's a reason we say it's just like riding a bike, because most people know how to ride a bike, especially if it's a cycle ergometer or a stationary bike or an Airdyne. They're pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah.
And it's really easy to just say, keep your heart rate at 135,
Yeah.
or keep it at 120. And that's okay. I think that stimulus can help for things like weight loss and recovery, can also help with performance. But, there are a bunch of ways to piece, high intensity interval training, high intensity steady state work, sub-threshold intensity steady state work, and even sub-threshold intensity interval training together, to achieve a whole bunch of goals, whether it's, performance or health.
Yeah. And I really want to get into some of the discussions surrounding more weight loss, use of different substrates in training and different levels of intensity, but we'll get to that in a second. I wanted to just continue along with our conversation from part one and talk a little bit about the determinants of endurance performance. So, like, what are you looking at, and what are we really tracking in that area?
Yeah, so I think this kind of links really well to the previous question about, if you have someone who's going to look at trying to perform at a marathon, let's say compete rather than complete. Um, so, if we're going to try to be competitive in some type of endurance event, really what we're looking at is this sort of sustainable velocity or power output. Um, if you're doing a 40K time trial on a bike, the faster you can go, the faster you'll be able, or the shorter duration it will be to complete that distance, right? Same with a marathon, 42 kilometers. If I can run faster, I'll be done quicker.
Mm-hmm.
But what I can't do is come out running at an extremely high velocity and then just slow down as the event goes on, because we probably won't achieve a fast time using that strategy.
Yeah.
So the things that determine your performance or sustainable velocity are really kind of fivefold. First would be your like maximal aerobic power or capacity. So this would be your VO2 max. So in exercise physiology courses or realms, we often ask that question, oh, what's your VO2 max? And you'll see healthy individuals somewhere in the mid to high 40s. You'll see elite endurance athletes sort of in the 70s. It doesn't really matter what you're measuring. You're measuring the amount of oxygen that your body can take in, transport, and utilize.
Yeah.
In mils per minute per kilogram of body weight.
Yeah.
And we'll see the highest recorded ones in and around like 94 or 96. Wow. On the other side of that, if you have heart failure, or you're on the list for a transplant, you might have a VO2 max of 10.
Yeah.
Activities of daily living require an oxygen consumption of about 12. Right. So if your VO2 max is 10, you're working above the maximum amount of oxygen you can take in, transport, and utilize to do work. And this means that you're relying on your anaerobic metabolism to get up off the couch and walk to the fridge. Somebody who's got a VO2 max of 94, those activities of daily living, they don't require, they require 10% of their aerobic energy capabilities. So they're really easy. And typically what we see is higher velocities, at least in endurance or aerobic events, require more oxygen.
Yeah.
So if you have a higher VO2 max and you have this really high ceiling, roof, like peak of your roof, that's a high potential for a high velocity.
Yeah.
The next piece that comes into play is what percentage of your VO2 max can you sustain? So we'd call that your fractional utilization. And people probably have heard this as your like anaerobic threshold. And so there's an intensity of exercise where your aerobic system can't supply all of the energy to do the muscular contractions. So once you pass that intensity, you then rely on some anaerobic metabolism to provide a little bit more energy to do contractions.
Yeah.
The drawback of going above that threshold is that you produce these sort of fatigue relating byproducts that result in impairment in contraction and fatigue. And so we said that the VO2 max is kind of like the ceiling or the roof. The anaerobic threshold would be the ceiling, right? So if you have a house with a really high roof and then a really high ceiling, you can sustain energy production and velocity at a really high rate, right? But let's say you have a really high roof, but a really low ceiling, you're relying on anaerobic metabolism to run faster.
Yeah.
So you can achieve the same sustainable power output or velocity with kind of two different strategies there. I can make someone's anaerobic threshold higher and not really train their max, or I can train their max, and as I make their max higher, usually that drags the anaerobic threshold up, right? 80% of 100 is 80, but 80% of 200, is 160. So you've made it higher just by making the VO2 max higher.
Yeah.
The other one that's really important would be like efficiency or economy. And so that's, what is the oxygen cost for the velocity that you're running at or cycling at? And what we see is that people who are really efficient require sort of less oxygen to produce a given power output. And that has things to do with like fiber types, your skill at that activity. So, excuse me, more type 1 fibers are more efficient. So again, going back to the conversation about the Ethiopians with that long limb length, really good at running, and then a high percentage of type 1 fibers, they're quite efficient runners.
Yeah.
Whereas me, when I'm running, like my arms out to the side and, bobbing back and forth, where you think about someone on a bike, if they're, really solid in that cycling position versus rocking back and forth, using more arms in cycling is not a very good thing. So that skill transfer plays a big role. There's two other things that kind of relate to endurance performance, and one would be this like anaerobic work capacity, or W prime, and that's the amount of anaerobic energy stores that you have. And what's interesting is that that's a finite amount of energy. So if I work at a really high intensity, I use that energy up really quickly. But if I work at a just above that sort of anaerobic threshold, it takes me a lot longer to use up that energy. So there are ways to, train to improve the amount of anaerobic energy that you have. And that's kind of related to things around your ability to clear and oxidize lactate, for example, and hydrogen ions. And then your buffering capabilities, whether it's, protein related buffers or transporters within the muscle cell. And then the last one is your oxygen uptake kinetics. So you've got maximal aerobic power capacity, you've got fractional utilization or anaerobic threshold, we've got economy or efficiency, that anaerobic work capacity, and then the last thing is oxygen uptake kinetics. And really that's how fast your aerobic energy system can turn on. And so typically what we see is in healthy individuals, it takes about 2 minutes for your aerobic metabolism or oxidative phosphorylation system to attain a steady state during sort of moderate intensity activities. I think the fastest I've seen is Paula Radcliffe. There's a paper, a case study on Paula Radcliffe. She held the women's marathon world record for years and years and years. And she had achieved an aerobic steady state within like 32 seconds. So she was able to produce energy completely via her aerobic system before most competitors would get to 63%. Like, I mean, it's so fast. So having a really fast oxygen uptake kinetics means you don't rely on anaerobic metabolism. So anytime you have a transition in intensity, you have this sort of delayed response in your aerobic system meeting the energy demands. So if you have really slow oxygen uptake kinetics, like older adults, for example, in my PhD, we looked at the oxygen uptake kinetics in older adults, and some of them achieved steady states in over 6 minutes. So, even longer, 12 minutes in some really deconditioned older adults. So those individuals are relying on anaerobic metabolism every time they switch intensity. So if you think about it from endurance performance, if you have to run up a hill, that's going to be a change in intensity, and you may rely on anaerobic metabolism if you have slow oxygen uptake kinetics more than someone who's got fast oxygen uptake kinetics.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. So that actually brings up a whole bunch more questions. So when we're looking at, like, let's just stick on the O2 uptake kinetics for a second, because I think it's very, very fascinating, the change and the difference between what the average is at 2 minutes and then what Paula Radcliffe was able to do with 32 seconds.
Yeah.
So what can the average individual do to really focus training on improving that piece, the O2 uptake kinetics specifically?
Yeah, so again, let's go back to the sort of previous session where we said we should do things that target the cardiovascular system, the muscle, capillarization, and the mitochondria.
Mm-hmm.
So the things that limit your oxygen uptake kinetics are sort of, there's sort of two camps. One camp would suggest that it's sort of delivery of oxygen that's an issue.
Mm-hmm.
And the other camp would say that it's utilization of oxygen that's the issue. So the camp that suggests that it's utilization would say that it takes time for aerobic enzymes to get activated. It takes time to take a molecule of glucose and run it through aerobic glycolysis to produce pyruvate to go into Krebs cycle to then produce reducing equivalents to go to the electron transport chain to then use oxygen to produce ATP.
Yeah.
Now we can open up our biochemistry primer for exercise sciences and go through all of those things.
Yeah.
But we need to know that we take a glucose and there's 11 steps to turn it into a pyruvate. That pyruvate goes into the citric acid cycle or Krebs cycle, and there's another 12 or 14 steps. And then all of the products of that go into the electron transport chain, and there's another 3 or 4 steps.
Mm-hmm.
And at each of those steps, there's an enzyme that controls that step. And so we need to have some sort of signal that says turn on. The other thing we have to do is we have to transport the glucose into the cell, or we use the stored glycogen in the cell, and then we produce the pyruvate, and the pyruvate has to get transported into the mitochondria. So there's another process there that requires some time.
Yeah.
So let's say someone like Paula Radcliffe, her aerobic enzymes have a high rate of activation, and all of those transporters or flux points of moving things around are really quick in Paula Radcliffe.
Yeah.
Now there's some suggestion that interval training does a really good job at training those enzymes and transporters to turn on and off. So again, if we look at the high intensity interval training side of the equation, what we see is this like high rate of ATP utilization, which produces a high amount of ADP or adenosine diphosphate.
Yeah.
When that phosphagen bond's broken, energy is released for muscle contraction. And in high intensity interval training, the switch from lots of ATP to ADP to ATP to ADP stimulates a sort of controller called AMP kinase. We're not going to go through what the AMP stands for because it's just alphabet soup.
Yeah.
But the stimulation of that AMPK or AMP kinase turns on another sort of metabolic master switch called PGC1 alpha. Again, alphabet soup, so we won't talk too much of that. But when we turn on PGC1 alpha, that creates some mitochondrial DNA expression to make more mitochondria as well as to make more enzymes that are related to aerobic metabolism. So having that energetic flux of 30 seconds on, 15 seconds on, 1 minute on, 1 minute off is a really profound stimulus for that PGC1 alpha. Now that really tends to have an impact on the O2 utilization side. Now, if you're in the camp of oxygen uptake kinetics control that says, no, it's O2 delivery.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that you're really attacking the O2 delivery part as well if you do high intensity interval training.
Yeah.
So the other side of this whole equation is if we do sustained contraction efforts. Sustained is not the right word. If we do rhythmic repetitive contractions for a longer period of time, so sub-threshold intensity steady state type activities, that turns on another pathway where there's lots of calcium release into the muscle cell, reuptake of calcium, release of calcium. And so this changing calcium content in the cell also has an impact on that PGC1 alpha. So we see this steady state activity increasing PGC1 alpha activation through a different mechanism, not the AMPK, but through calcium activation. And this also has an impact on that sort of mitochondrial biogenesis side of things. So that steady state activity also turns on the sort of genetic response to make more enzymes and more mitochondria.
Hmm.
I think the advantage, and okay, maybe I'm showing my bias that I think that steady state work is important. I think the advantage of some of that steady state work now is that we do some things that improve O2 delivery as well. So maybe we make a bigger heart or a bigger chamber size, we make the blood vessels a little bit more compliant, and we improve our ability to deliver oxygen.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
So again, this is the argument for, if you want to get better at endurance performance, you probably need to target all 5 of those things.
Yeah.
But I think what we would see is more direct targeting of our training towards VO2 max, anaerobic threshold, and efficiency. And then we'd see, just by the fact that we're doing good training, oxygen uptake, kinetics, speeding, and that anaerobic work capacity also getting a little bit bigger. I'm not sure if I would specifically target oxygen uptake kinetics as a training strategy.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And I think this goes back to what you were saying at the beginning with regards to having a good assessment and an understanding of the client that you have in front of you and maybe which bucket they struggle in, right? So if they do have a really high roof but a low ceiling, bringing up that ceiling will be important. And if they have kind of a moderate roof, but high ceiling, right? Being able to, right? So figuring out which bucket needs to be filled and then going after that with most of the time that you're putting in there, but making sure that you hit both sides of that. I think it's good. So this actually brings up another question, because I think it has to do perfectly with that both the anaerobic threshold, so that fractional utilization, as well as the O2 uptake kinetics, is when we're looking at something like those repetitive wind gates that we were talking about earlier. We were talking about a lot of those metabolic byproducts being produced, and when they're really, really strong, the body needs to get rid of them. And so one of the responses the body has is feeling nauseous, puking, headaches, those types of things. And so when we have a client who experiences that on a fairly regular basis, what are some of the things that we as trainers and strength and conditioning coaches can do to minimize the effects of that while still kind of pushing them to that limit without pushing them over and having them feel and ruin the rest of the session?
Yeah, so I think it's probably 2 things. I'll go back on my bias of a really good cardiovascular system. So I think one of the things that we want to try to do from a performance perspective is we don't want to get to that state where we're using, glycolysis and anaerobic metabolism as the main energy system to produce energy. Now, if you have a 30-second all-out thing that you have to do, you're going to have to use your anaerobic system. So, there's no way we can make your aerobic system that powerful that you won't have to use the anaerobic system.
Yeah.
But if we can make the aerobic system contribute more, so like you said, bring the roof and the ceiling up as high as possible, maybe we don't have to rely on anaerobic metabolism as much.
Yeah.
Now, that might not be the best approach for, like you said, the 30-second intervals or the, let's say the sort of, 2010 Tabata kind of thing. Or if we're doing sort of high intensity resistance type training where we're doing minute on, minute off type stuff, EMOMs or AMRAPs and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yes, a highly trained aerobic system will help in the recovery period. So, clearing lactate, managing hydrogen ions, managing the high amounts of ammonia and high levels of calcium interfering with sort of reuptake. That sort of stuff is mitigated by having a high aerobic system. So your aerobic system is like the garbage man at the end of the interval.
Mm-hmm.
Replacing ATP is all done aerobically.
Yeah.
So again, that's sort of evidence for a highly trained aerobic system. But if you're really focusing on anaerobic effort events, and I think this is debatable in sports, again, goes back to that comment, if you're the hockey player that runs around the ice crazy for 2 minutes, probably not a good hockey player, don't understand the technical and tactical demands of the game. And then if you're going all out for 2 minutes, that's not using your aerobic system, that's using your glycolytic system. That's maybe different than coming to the gym and doing the sort of 30 on, 30 off kind of things where we're trying to train the glycolytic system. And I think in that case, really what we're trying to do is we're trying to bring somebody right to the point where they're going to feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But finding that intensity that doesn't push them past that. Do I have an exact prescription for that? I'd say no. You probably have to do some trial and error. Using devices like rowing ergometers, Airdynes, ski ergs, Kaiser M3 bikes that have sort of power output displays on them.
Yeah.
That would be the way I would tackle that. I want you to hold, 400 watts for 30 seconds. And if that makes somebody ridiculously fatigued, okay, maybe I need to back it off to 350.
Yeah.
The other thing I think you can do is play with the interval, like duration, as well as the recovery duration. So there's these ideas that if you're really working on the glycolytic side of sort of high intensity interval training, your recovery should probably be, more towards the passive side or very, very light, and it can be longer to get somebody back to a state where they feel a little bit more ready to go, like they've cleared some byproducts. I mean, half-time of recovery for some of these systems, the ATP PCR system, to get half of your ATP and PCR recovered takes sort of 30 seconds, but to get all the way recovered takes about 5 minutes. To clear sort of muscle lactate, probably have a half time of about 5-ish minutes, but a full time more towards the 20-minute period. To clear hydrogen ion, which is maybe a better representative of some of the fatiguing byproducts, it's a little bit longer. Maybe it's 8 minutes in the muscle and for a half time, and a bit longer than that for maybe 30 minutes for a full time. I'm not saying take a 30-minute interval, like recovery interval, but just be aware that you might need that 5 minutes or 8 minutes to clear some of that byproduct. Whereas if you just used a 1 minute or 2 minute recovery bout, your next interval bout is just adding to that level of fatigue related byproducts. So by the time you get to the 5th interval, you've got absolutely no recovery from a byproduct perspective.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, and
You
I
know,
think
so again, don't avoid the work. I think do the work, play with the intensity duration relationship of the work, but also don't be afraid to give a little bit more recovery to clear some of that byproduct. Now, the other side of that is, are you really adapting to that stimulus if you let everything clear every time?
yeah.
I think you walk that fine line of making somebody throw up versus making them adapt to that stimulus. And you probably got to pull back a little bit if people are feeling really sick.
Yeah, and I think with, when you look at whether it be, cardiorespiratory training or whether it be, resistance training, that progressive overload idea and like where are you starting and how fast you progress is going to be very individual. Is going to be very specific to the person you have in front of you and how they're responding to the stimulus. And then you're going to have to change things like all the time, right? So you might have somebody who you've planned specific interval, specific maybe wattage that you're going to do the intensity at on cycle ergometer or something like that, and then all of a sudden you're like, okay, so that was a bit too high, you go down and then you add a little bit more rest, and so you adjust those intervals. And I think not being afraid to do that is really important when
Right,
we're looking
right.
at training and working with clients, is not being afraid to change things. Even though you may have something pre-planned, you may have an idea of what will work, it may not work. And what do you do in the face of it? Are you adaptable in that situation, you as
Yeah,
a trainer, right?
and I think it goes back to your comment earlier too about, as a young or new personal trainer, strength coach, you spent your time focusing on the resistance training side of things because
Yeah.
people needed more coaching. And you wouldn't be afraid to drop a set if the person looked fatigued, or you wouldn't be afraid to have a regression of an exercise if their form looked compromised.
Yeah.
But I think you're right that maybe we haven't given ourselves permission to do that from energy systems training or cardiorespiratory training perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. I think when it comes to cardio, a lot of people are, kind of balls to the wall, push as hard as you can. You'll only get what you put in, whatever you want to say, whatever cliche you want to put in there,
Right.
or fashionable t-shirt that you want to wear. Uh, there's that idea that more is better. And so
Mm,
you just do more and more and more, when there's kind of that fine line, right? There's that diminishing returns where you kind of go to a point and then it just starts going downhill from there. The body actually starts to reject what you're doing.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I would say the comments of more is better or less is better, I mean, I would disagree with those and just say better
yeah,
is better.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I like there was a quote. Have you ever? There's a show on Netflix called Quantico. No, not Quantico. Waco. So it's all about Waco, Texas, the stuff that went on there. But one like has nothing to do with that. But one of the quotes from the negotiator is that there is a like a caveat to power. The more power you bring to a situation, the more likely you are to encounter resistance to that power.
Mm,
So I talk about that when I'm talking about manual therapy, right? When you look at massage or foam rolling, if you're wincing in the presence of some manual therapy or foam rolling, your body is actually rejecting what you're doing and it's getting tighter because of that. Just as you push way too much weight, your body's going to reject that more than it's going to adapt to it. And you might get a poor adaptation rather than the adaptation you're looking for. And I think it's the same in this scenario as well.
yeah, totally, totally.
So unfortunately, we are pretty much out of time. So I just want to quickly walk through like a very quick lightning round, and then I'll let you get out of here.
Yeah,
So
you bet.
three quick questions. First things that come to mind, and we'll go from there. So first question is the top three books that you've read on any topic.
Yeah, I gave quite a bit of thought to this one because you set this up a little bit earlier. I think one that's like culture related would be Legacy by James Kerr. That's the All Blacks
Yeah.
story. Yeah, it just kind of really resonated with me as I went through it. Another one that's impacted me immensely as an educator is a book called Educated. The author's Tara Westover.
Okay.
Um, unbelievable story. Unbelievable story. I probably got through it in a day and a half.
Yeah.
And then the last one I would say, I'll give you a sort of textbook kind of one, would be Science and Application of High Intensity Interval Training. That's Paul Larson and Martin Boucher's new textbook and course that they have. I don't know how he did it, but Paul wrote 600 pages on high intensity interval training.
Wow.
And the sort of second half of that book is all sort of sport and domain specific stuff. So, you know, written by, let's say the hockey one's got Adam Douglas from Hockey Canada wrote the chapter on hockey training. So, you know, really powerful resource.
Yeah.
For this type of stuff.
I love it. So I was looking over at my bookshelf as you were saying a couple of those books. So Legacy, I've read, I have that. And then Educated, I haven't read yet, but my wife has, and she has it here somewhere on this book. I was looking for it, but I can't see it.
As we speak.
Yeah.
Read it tonight. Now that you're starting the academic year.
I will.
Yeah, huge impact.
Yeah, I will. And then I don't have that textbook, but I will absolutely pick it up after this this conversation. Next question. Your top 3 mentors so far in your career?
I'm going to ask for 4 because first one, I'm going to say my parents, of course. They, you know, always stood behind me. So gotta say thanks to them.
Yep.
And then the other 3, probably my high school basketball coach, Tom Elniski. When I first met him, he was overweight, high stressed, Bobby Knight throwing chairs kind of guy. And I thought, man, I never want to play basketball for this guy. But then by the time I got to high school, he was like 160 pounds, Zen master, super fit. And I kind of went to a high school in a rough neighborhood. And he turned a lot of potential criminals into really good contributing members of society.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, he passed away from brain cancer when I was in university, but again, his sort of legacy is living on, which is great to see.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And then my other 2 would be my master's degree supervisor and my PhD supervisor. So Gord Bell was my master's supervisor, and I still say to this day, when I grow up, I want to be just like Gord Bell, but I realize that I'm as old as he was when he was teaching me my master's degree, so I better grow up. And he just provided me with this like applied sports and exercise physiology degree that was, you know, sort of amazing. Training rowers for 10 weeks, and he was there every minute, and the guy could run 4 VO2 max tests by himself at a time. Just this old school exercise and sport scientist.
Yeah.
And then my PhD supervisor, Don Patterson, is kind of one of these originals in the world of exercise across the lifespan. So he started his career looking at kids, then he moved into adults, and then he moved into older adults. You know, a couple hundred publications across his career, and you know, director of the Canadian Centre for Activity and Aging, and president of the Canadian Society for Exercise Physiology. And those guys just, you know, opened doors and showed me the way to both do science and teach people. So I'm indebted to them beyond belief.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'll allow you to have 4. It's okay. Technically that's 5 because you said your parents, so that's 2. So anyways,
that's true. It's like when people say, is that Greg with 2 G's? Yeah, the beginning and the end. There's 2 G's.
Yeah.
People who spell their name Gregg, that's actually 3 G's.
Yeah. I love it. Okay. And then other than grow up, what would Greg of today say to 20-year-old Greg?
Oh man, I'm not sure how to answer that one, because like I said, I wouldn't wish my path on anybody, but it got me exactly what I want. Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe it's don't sell that first house. I don't know. Hang on to it.
Yeah.
Or don't buy that first house.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I think I would just say still like take those opportunities, and take the ones that just sort of happen. Be nice, start with good people, and the rest of things will sort of take care of themselves.
Yeah.
But I don't know if there's too much in my life that I would want to, do over or take another stab at, to be fair.
Yeah.
Maybe don't put your daughter in competitive dance, because it costs a lot of money and uses up all my free time.
Yeah. Yeah. I hear you. Like, I don't have kids, so the house thing, I just bought my first house, so we'll, hopefully I don't have the same don't sell the first house regret.
Yeah,
I don't have kids yet, so I'll take your advice about not putting them in competitive dance.
It's what I open the semester with in my intro classes is these are my daughters. This one dances all the time, and this other one, we just had her so we could do experiments on her. And
yeah,
it's a picture, video of her doing a VO2 max test at 4,000 meters in California at White Mountain. So
yeah. I love the idea of having your child and almost doing experiments constantly, like, because in the profession we're in, we're all about development and adaptation. And so I'm like, hey, when I have kids, they're my personal guinea pigs, I guess,
yeah.
to run experiments on.
I think you should film your kids growing up trying to do physically active things, because watching that progression of their sort of growth and motor development is pretty cool.
Yeah, I know with my nephew, he's now coming up with 3.5 now, and it's been, I was there, and we actually filmed his first time ever rolling, and so that was pretty cool. And like when he was just crawling, I would crawl on the ground with him all throughout, and now he's walking, but you still see him, learning how to climb stairs better and learning how to climb into and out of cars without having the help of somebody else. So yeah, as you said, really, really cool. And when it's my kid, I'll film it all, and I'll maybe post some of it or create
you just save it for their wedding day.
Oh man. Yeah. So many. And I'm actually thankful I was born when I was, because the amount of stupid things that I did and embarrassing things that I did when I was young, man.
Yeah, no comment. No comment.
Okay, so I just want to end off by asking you, where can the audience go to find more information about you and what you're doing, and maybe some of the research that you've got going on?
Yeah, so our faculty website is like hes.ok.ubc.ca. I mean, a Google search of, Greg duManoir, UBC Okanagan, would find some of the things, take you to my sort of academic homepage. You can find me on Twitter at gduManoir. Not super active, but usually it's educationally related. Instagram, I think, is Greg duManoir. You can tell I'm super into the social media. I look at it, but I don't post on it very often.
Yeah.
And then, if people want to reach out, I'm happy to chat via email. So it's just greg.duManoir@ubc.ca, and I'm sure we can get that in the show notes or episode notes so that people can find it.
Sounds good. Well, thanks for your time. We went a little bit past when I said I would guarantee you we were going to be done, but
no problem.
So much interest, because this is an area where I was really good at the very beginning. Right when I graduated university, I had all this knowledge, and then I kind of let it slip a little bit. And it's so funny how much you forget. And then when we were talking, just so much interest in the cardiorespiratory, the cardiovascular system, and the response to training, and how we can better prep not only athletes but general population as well for success throughout their life, throughout aging, throughout athletics. So thanks very much for your time.
Yeah, it's been fun. My pleasure.
And we'll have to get you on, because as I said, I've got a whole bunch of questions, so we'll have to get you on again, maybe the beginning of second semester or something like that.
Yeah, sounds good.
All right. Take care, Greg.
Thanks, Adam.
State of the Industry Podcast.